Now, you mentioned earlier this idea of kind of, I can't remember the exact words, but somehow doing improvement and sort of looking at your processes and improving them. Is there a formal way that Kanban does this? Like, is there anything about a policy or a rule or an event or a process that Kanban asks teams to use to improve the way they work?
So in other methodologies like Scrum, those are called ceremonies, and in Kanban, those are called feedback loops. So there are two types of feedback loops: those that are focused on the work, and those that are focused on the method and the way the teams are doing. So you evaluate, like Scrum, you have the moment to review the work, you have the moment to evaluate how much you are getting done, if there is any impediment. It's very similar to Scrum at this point. And the other part, there's a moment to improve, similar to a retrospective, which is the moment for you to evaluate how you are doing in terms of delivery. Are you following what is expected? Are your metrics achieving what you were looking for? And also some other interesting ones where you evaluate the operations and the risk of doing and getting the work done. So, for example, if you're not performing as you would like, what should we do? Let's revisit and make some changes in the team. Maybe we need more people. Maybe we need less people. And also to keep the pace as we would like, things like what kind of technology should we use? Are we using technical? Do we have a good software in place? Do we have the right resources to support us and get the work done? That's what we would see in the risk and operations review as well.
Risk and operations review. Okay, cool. And I know you mentioned metrics here, and I know especially in a large enterprise where the organization is trying to do scaled agile, like there Scrum doesn't say much about metrics. Scaled agile actually also doesn't say too much about metrics, but I know that Kanban has a lot of guidance about how you measure things, how you handle that measurement, how it goes back into the feedback loops. What are just like maybe one or two simple kind of ideas in terms of measurement that Kanban brings to scaled agile?
So one important thing is to evaluate first your throughput. So how many items do you get done every week, every day, every month? You define the duration. But usually, let's say if you have a sprint or if you don't have a sprint, you define a time frame. So let's say a week, and how much stories, how much work, how many tickets you are getting done every single week. If that satisfies your need, that's a good and first metric. If it does not, you have the feedback loops that I mentioned before to define the right ways to improve the process. That's one. So throughput. The other one is the lead time. And lead time is understanding how much time it took from the beginning to the end until the work was completed. Was that one day, 10 days, 1 week, 10 months? So the lead time is also an important way to start evaluating how fast we can deliver something that is requested. And a good and interesting thing is to evaluate lead time for the different classes of services. So, for example, if something is requested right away, how quick do you respond to those things? 2 days, 3 days? So that's a good reference for you to know that other work items can also follow that metric. So some others, when they are not urgent, how much time do they take? Does it take 2 weeks, 3, 4, 6? I've seen organizations taking sometimes forever, months. But this reference and using these two classes of service, two work types, we can compare how great we can perform in some situations and how terrible can if that's not urgent. Now, those are two important metrics. Now, the lead time, which is the total time, is the sum of every cycle time of every step. So if you sum them up every single time, you're going to identify the lead time. And why is that important? Because knowing the cycle time, you can also identify some bottlenecks. And the bottleneck is the one that has the least capacity to deliver things or deliver items in your process. With that in mind, knowing your bottleneck, knowing where it hurts, you can define the action and improve your efficiencies.
Yeah, so in a scaled agile environment, I know that scaled agile allows the teams in a release train to use Scrum or Kanban. And I know that in practice, actually, a lot of teams combine the two. But what I find interesting about lead time is that in scaled agile, the teams in a release train might actually have dependencies between them. And so when you're measuring lead time, it's not just what happens inside of one team. It's actually getting the work started to when it's actually completed, regardless of whether it bounces around 2 or 3 or 4 teams. Now, one other thing about lead time that's really interesting is that there are different ways to measure lead time, and people don't always do it right. So for example, I know when I've done some coaching and consulting, sometimes teams say, well, we're gonna measure when we start working on something to when we finish working on something, and that's what we're gonna call lead time. But that's not always the best way to do it, is it?
You know, it's a start.
It's a
So
start.
you have nothing, that's a good start, and start measuring the items. Now, will that reflect the pattern of your process? Not necessarily. So lead time, if you can just measure a few, make sure you are measuring what kind of work type that is. So I mentioned the expedited one, the intangible one. So how many items you get to measure those things. Again, it's one approach. The other approach would be you have it's a more complicated part, which is called Leto's law, but you would use the items that you have in progress and you would divide by another factor. So there are many different, but the important part I would emphasize is as long as you are aware that that number represents a picture, not the movie of what's going on, and you use that to improve your system, that's a
Mhm.
good start.
Yeah. And so in scaled agile, teams might have retrospectives. There's also increment planning where the whole program, release train gets together. There's a lot of opportunities. But I know also in Kanban that there's some principles in Kanban, right? Like encouraging individual acts of leadership. And these principles can sometimes be a little bit tough to match up with what goes on in a bigger enterprise or in a safe environment.